and gentlemen, welcome to the final round of the teacher tournament. We have Mrs. Joyce, our episode 1 champion and art teacher, it says here at Holy Trinity School in Avon. Okay, we have our episode 2 winner. It says 3rd grade teacher Mrs. Lynch, also from Holy Trinity in Avon. And the biggest comeback we've had so far, Mrs. Triplett, who defeated Mr. Nunny, who had 16 questions right, but he choked on the final round. Well, the winner today will have bragging rights as not only the smartest person at Holy Trinity, but also the grand teacher champion. So, without further ado, let us begin the game. For those of you that are new to the game, it works by raising your hand if you know the answer. If you don't know the answer, don't raise your hand. Okay. We have one daily double hidden on the board, and we will go by the easiest question here to decide who goes first. What is 1 plus 1? Mrs. Joyce.
2.
2. Okay, Mrs. Joyce, you can have control of the board. Our categories are science, math, social studies, starts with the letter M, and movies again. Where movies works, for those of you that are new to this, is I will give you characters, and you will tell me what movie they are from. Mrs. Joyce, where would you like to go?
I'm going to go movies for 100.
Okay, movies for 100, not the daily double. Dorothy and Toto. Mrs. Joyce.
Wizard of Oz.
Wizard of Oz, that's 100. Mrs. Joyce, where would you like to go?
Same category, 200, Bob.
Okay, 200. We have the characters of Timon and Mufasa. Mrs. Triplett.
Lion King.
Lion King, 200. Mrs. Triplett, where would you like to go?
Starts with M for 500.
Ah,
I know!
Stories. Okay.
Hang on, girl.
Your starts with the letter M question is... So many sheets here, you guys. This is what happens when you're a host. There it is. 500. What do you call a group of crows? A what, Mrs. Triplett?
A murder.
A murder. That is correct.
Oh, how did you even know that?
My son's an animal lover.
Okay.
Okay, where would you like to go, Mrs. Triplett?
Let's go science for 500.
Girl, what is wrong with you? Okay, come on.
Hey,
Like a game.
science.
Sharon, you're not allowed to answer that.
What species can live on both water and land? Mrs. Lynch.
Amphibian?
That is correct for 500. Where would you like to go, Mrs. Lynch?
Oh, how about starts with M for 100?
Starts with M for 100. Okay. That is not the daily double. But the question is, first name of basketball legend Jordan. Joyce, what do you got, Mrs. Joyce?
What is Michael Jordan?
Okay, Mrs. Joyce, where would you like to go?
Starts with M for 200.
Okay. Months that start with the letter M. I need all of them. Mrs. Joyce.
March, May. Yeah, March,
That
May.
is correct. Okay, so those of you playing at home, Mrs. Joyce has 400. Mrs. Triplett still in the lead with 700, and Mrs. Lynch with 500. A very close game so far. Mrs. Joyce, where would you like to go?
I'm going to go movies for 300.
Movies for 300. Not the daily double, but the question is, Mrs. Potts and Belle. Mrs. Joyce.
Beauty and the Beast.
Beauty and the Beast, and we have a tie for first place.
Come on, Mrs. Joyce.
Mrs. Joyce, where would you like to go?
Movies for 400.
Katniss Everdeen. Mrs. Triplett.
It is the Hunger Games.
It is the Hunger Games for 400. Okay, where would you like to go, Mrs. Triplett?
Let's go science for 400.
Okay, science for 400. Hey, what is the freezing point of water? Mrs. Joyce.
32 degrees
What?
Fahrenheit.
Correct. Okay, 1100 to 500.
Who has 500 or 1100? Give us the name.
Mrs. Lynch has 500. Mrs. Triplett and Mrs. Joyce with 1100.
Ooh, okay, Mrs. Triplett, I see you. Let's go to social studies for 100.
Social studies for 100. What are the 3 branches of government? Mrs. Joyce.
What is legislative, executive, and judicial?
That is correct. Where would you like to go?
I'm going to go same category, 200.
200. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were the first men to do what, Mrs. Triplett?
Fly to the moon.
I cannot accept fly to the moon. Mrs.
Fly me
Joyce.
to the moon.
Mrs. Joyce.
That would be a walk on the moon, Mrs.
That
Triplett.
That is correct. Okay, so Mrs. Joyce pulling ahead, 1,400. Mrs. Triplett, 1,100. Mrs. Lynch in third still with 500. Where would you like to go, Mrs. Joyce?
I'm going to go movies for 500, Bob.
Okay, your characters are Buddy Hobbs and Miles Finch.
Oh my gosh.
Don't pretend like you know it.
But I do. Miles Finch. I just watched this.
You did not.
I did.
And all of you have watched this movie.
I feel like your time is up. I feel like
5, 4, 3. Mrs.
Come on.
Triplett.
I think, okay, Miles Hobbs is the father.
Well,
Buddy-
Miles Finch and Buddy Hobbs.
I don't even know
Okay.
his name.
Bud is the son in Elf, and Miles is his father. It is Elf.
It is Elf. That is
I
correct.
watched it. I knew I watched it.
So,
Right.
what Mrs. Triplett was trying to tell you was Miles Finch was the man that was an angry little person. He was not Buddy's dad.
He wasn't?
No, that was Walter Hobbs.
So did she get it right or not?
He was right.
No.
It's Elf.
Okay, where would you like to go, Mrs. Triplett?
Starts with M, 400.
Oh, this is an easy one.
All right.
Spell my last name, Mrs. Joyce.
Capital MODZELESKI.
That is correct for 400 and the lead. Mrs. Joyce,
That
100.
was good, Mrs.
Mrs. Triplett was 1,600, and Mrs. Lynch just lying in the weeds with 500.
No, what are you doing over there, Nellie? Wake up. All right. We're gonna go with starts with M for 300.
Okay, starts with M for 300. Your question is, what is the capital of Vermont? Mrs. Lynch.
I was
Mount
out of
Montpelier?
Mount
Montpelier.
Montpelier is correct. So that is Mrs. Lynch 800, Mrs. Triplett 1,600, Mrs. Joyce 800. Mrs. Lynch, where would you like to go?
Oh, how about science for 300?
Science for 300.
Mess this up.
The question is, the hardest naturally occurring mineral and a girl's best friend. Mrs. Lynch.
What are diamonds?
What are diamonds? That gives you 1,100, Mrs. Triplett 16, and Mrs. Joyce still in the lead with 1,800. Where would you like to go, Mrs. Lynch?
Science for 200.
It's for 200. What is the chemical formula for water? Mrs. Lynch.
H2O.
H2O, that is correct. 1,300. Catching up on Mrs. Triplett. Mrs. Joyce still in the lead, though.
It's science for 100.
A caterpillar changes and grows into what? Mrs. Joyce.
Butterfly.
A butterfly, 1,900. Mrs. Joyce, where would you like to go? We have 2 categories left.
I'm gonna go social studies for 300.
And that is our daily double. Mrs. Joyce, you can wager up to 1,900 points, and this question is only yours.
Well, you got to tell me what everybody else has. Give me some information.
Okay, Mrs. Triplett has 1,600. Mrs. Lynch has 1,300. It's a very close game. You are all separated by $300.
Well, I'm gonna say 300.
Okay. Mrs. Joyce, the question is only for you, and your question is, from whom did the United States buy the territory in the Louisiana Purchase? So you can either give me the country or the person.
I'm I'm going to say, who is France or Napoleon? Like what?
Those are both the correct answers. Napoleon and France. Great job, Mrs. Joyce. That gives you 2,200, 600 more than Mrs. Triplett, and 900 more than Mrs. Lynch. Where would you like to go, Mrs. Joyce?
Well, I'm going to say, Bob, I'm going to go 400 on social studies.
Mrs. Joyce has done a great job in this category, you guys.
I used to be very good at social studies, I'll have you know.
The next question is, the United States and Mexico are separated by which river? Mrs. Joyce.
Rio de Janeiro?
Oh, that is incorrect. Mrs. Lynch, you were second.
The Rio Grande.
I mean,
Rio
that's what I
Grande.
meant.
Yes.
Poop, poop, poop.
That
Okay.
drops Mrs. Joyce to 1,800. It brings Mrs. Lynch up to second place with 1,700. So everyone, it's a 100-point game. Mrs. Lynch, where would you like to go?
I'll finish the category for 500.
Hey,
Social studies.
we are avoiding math. Like
We are.
We are. Yes, we are, like the Black Plague.
Okay, so social studies. The first fireworks were invented in the 7th century in what country? Mrs. Triplett.
Japan?
Ooh, Japan is incorrect. And that cost you 500.
I meant to say something.
Mrs. Lynch.
I think it's China.
China is correct. That puts Mrs. Lynch in the lead with 2,200. That drops Mrs. Triplett to 1,100, and Mrs. Joyce with 1,800. So, Mrs. Lynch, you are in the lead with that answer. Where would you like to go?
Oh, math for 100. Easy math.
It is easy math.
Easy. Better be easy.
If I have 2 dozen donuts, how many donuts do I have? Mrs. Triplett.
24.
That is correct, and that gives you 1,200. Only 1,000 less than Mrs. Lynch.
Math for 500.
Uh-oh. Remember, as you go up, the questions do get more difficult.
Okay, it's okay.
When writing out a fraction, the numbers above and below the vinculum are called the what, Mrs. Triplett?
Above is the numerator, below is the denominator.
That is correct. You have 1,700, Mrs. Joyce 1,800, Mrs. Lynch 2,200.
Ooh.
Where would you like to go, Mrs. Triplett?
Math 400.
Okay, if Mrs. Joyce gets this, it could tie her for the lead. If a football field is 100 yards long, how many feet is it? Mrs. Lynch?
300.
300. That gives Mrs. Lynch 2,600. Mrs. Triplett 1,700. Mrs. Joyce 1,800. Where would you like to go, Mrs. Lynch? We have 2 questions left.
Oh, math for 300.
Math for 300.
Math is hard.
A hexagon has how many sides? Mrs. Joyce?
6.
6 is correct. That gives you 2,100. Mrs. Triplett 1,700, but Mrs. Lynch still in the lead. Our last question is the $200 math question. And please think about this carefully.
Uh-oh.
How many face cards are in a regular deck of playing cards? Mrs. Triplett's hand was up first.
There, in a regular deck of playing cards, there are 12 face cards.
That is correct. That puts you at 1,900. Okay, our final question tonight. We have Mrs. Joyce still with 2,100, Mrs. Triplett with 1,900, and Mrs. Lynch and Lee with 2,600. The final category this evening is Holy Trinity. Please write down your wagers at this time. Mrs. Joyce again 2,100, Mrs. Triplett 1,900, and Mrs. Lynch 2,600. Mrs. Lynch, do you have your amount written down?
I do.
Since this is the championship, I'm going to need to know all of these beforehand. So, Mrs. Lynch, what did you wager?
I wrote down 2,000.
2,000.
But
Okay.
it's backwards.
What did you write down?
1,900.
You wagered it all. And Mrs. Joyce, what did you wager?
Oh.
Went all in, 2,100. Okay. Okay. At this time, if you could write down the answer to this question, it is, what HT employee would be listed last in alphabetical order by first name?
Oh.
What HT employee would be listed last in alphabetical order by first name? So I'm looking for a first name that would be last. Maybe they're playing in this game. Maybe they're not. Now, I'll give you a second. This is a more difficult question than we've had previously.
Yeah. Are you sure you don't want to do last name? Because I got that one.
No, that's okay. We're going to do first names. Miss Yagi would be very appreciative of that if it was. But this is the championship round, and we have to make things a little more difficult. What is that person's first name? Okay, I'm going to give you 10 more seconds. Mrs. Lynch, have you written down an answer?
I have.
Don't do not say it though. Mrs. Triplet, have you written down an answer?
I have 3. I'm crossing out all but one. Yes.
That'd be great. Thank you.
You won't be able to read it, though. Should I recap it?
No, that's okay. Mrs. Joyce, do you have an answer? Okay. Mrs. Lynch, we're going to start with Mrs. Triplet because she had the least amount. Mrs. Triplet, which one of those 3 answers did you go with?
I went with, in my messy writing, Sherry St. John.
Ooh, Sherry St. John. Yes, that's a great name. She was in our game show, The Scavenger Hunt. Okay, Mrs. Joyce, you have 2,100. Who did you say you wagered?
Okay, I have a little bit of a logistics question though, because it's like any staff that worked at our school, like second and third quarter, any teacher in the homeroom.
Oh.
I would take either one of these answers, so I will take that answer if you would like to say it. You said Mrs. Cornell.
Yes.
Okay, did you have?
Or Mrs.
Okay, there's also another one I would have accepted.
Yes, I know it.
You want to tell me that one?
Mrs. Cowden.
Mrs. Cowden. Okay. Mrs. Lynch, what did you say?
You know what? I wasn't sure if you said staff, so I was thinking it was Steve.
Ooh.
But I forgot Mrs. Cowden.
Yes, with a T. Mrs. Cornell and Mrs. Cowden would have been the 2 answers I would have accepted. So congratulations, Mrs. Joyce. You are our teacher champion, and you will be battling our 8th graders next week. Congratulations, though, to Mrs. Triplet and Mrs. Lynch. This was the closest game we've had all season.
I know. I thought, Mrs. Lynch, you were going to get me, girl.
Yeah, I woke up.
We're sleeping over there.
So again, we got to remember, you guys, that we are on a West Coast shooting schedule, and we are shooting very late in the evening. So Mrs. Lynch was already asleep, and we had to wake her up to play. But again, we thank you all, Holy Trinity community, for watching, and please join us next time.
Go get 'em, Mrs.